There's a version of Italy that most people never talk about. Not the Italy of Ferrari, not Lamborghini, not the Dolce Vita, not Sophia Loren draped across a sports car on the Amalfi Coast. I'm talking about the Italy of 1945. A country on its knees, roads cracked and broken, factories reduced to rubble, a people hungry not just for food, but for something harder to name, for dignity, for movement. For a future that didn't smell like ash. Turin, the city that would become the heart of Italian industry, had been hammered from the sky. The Mirafiori plant, Fiat's crown jewel, barely existed anymore. Allied bombers had made sure of that. The fascist government had tried to scatter manufacturing across the country to protect it from attack, but the damage was done. The industrial spine of northern Italy was fractured, and nobody could say with any confidence when or whether it would be put back together. And yet, somewhere inside that wreckage, there was still a car. A modest, unpretentious, thoroughly ordinary little machine with a 1,089 cubic centimeter engine and 4 cylinders that asked for nothing more than a road to run on. The Fiat 1100. You might hear that name and feel nothing, and that's exactly the point. The cars that change the world rarely announce themselves. They don't roar. They don't make you turn your head in the street. And they just show up, day after day, year after year, doing what needs to be done while the glamorous ones get all the attention. This is the story of that car, and it's also, whether it sounds like it yet or not, the story of how a broken country rebuilt itself from the ground up, how ordinary people found their footing again. How an entire culture of design and artistry, what the world now calls Italian style, was born not in the studios of great masters, but on the chassis of a family saloon that cost less than most people earned in a year. What happened between 1945 and 1969 is one of the most extraordinary national transformations in modern history, and the 1100 was right there at the center of it. Invisible, essential, and almost completely forgotten by the histories that prefer their heroes loud and obvious. That's the story worth telling. It starts before the war, before the bombs, before everything fell apart. It starts in 1937, in the engineering offices of Fiat in Turin, with a quietly brilliant man named Dante Giacosa staring at a blank sheet of paper and asking himself a very simple question. What does the Italian family actually need? Dante Giacosa was not the kind of man who made headlines. He didn't race cars or court the press. He was an engineer in the truest and most serious sense, someone who believed that any problem had a solution if you were disciplined enough and precise enough to find it. He would later design the Fiat 500, one of the most beloved cars ever made. But before that, he gave Italy something it needed even more urgently than charm. He gave it something that worked. In 1937, the problem he was handed was this: build a car for the middle of Italy. Not the wealthy industrialists of the north, not the struggling peasants of the south, the middle. 2. The teachers and the mechanics and the shopkeepers and the factory foremen who needed something reliable, affordable, and tough enough to handle roads that were, in many places, barely roads at all. Roads that flooded in autumn, cracked in summer heat, and rattled the teeth of anyone foolish enough to drive them at speed. What he created was the Fiat 508C, the Balilla 1100, nicknamed by Italians simply the Millicento, 1100. It had a 4-cylinder overhead valve engine displacing exactly 1,089 cubic centimeters, producing 32 horsepower. A 4-speed manual gearbox. Independent front suspension. A chassis that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely advanced, well-balanced, rigid where it needed to be rigid, forgiving where the road demanded forgiveness. Nothing about it screamed. Everything about it delivered. In 1938, Giacosa took that same chassis and did something that surprised the entire Italian motorsport establishment. He built a streamlined racing Berlinetta, the 508C Mil Miglia, and entered it in the most brutal road race in existence. 1,000 miles across Italy on public roads, through mountains and valleys and medieval town centers that were not remotely designed for racing cars. The little 1100 won its class. Average speed, 112 kilometers per hour. 16th place overall. in a field that included purpose-built machinery from much larger and better-funded operations. For a car designed to carry a schoolteacher's family to church on Sunday, that result was almost offensive in the best possible way. Between 1937 and 1948, 122,000 examples of the original Fiat 1100 were built. That is not a niche product. That is the car of a nation, a car that a significant portion of the Italian population either owned, was saving to own, or traveled in regularly because a neighbor, or a colleague, or a relative owned one. And then the war came, and the factories fell silent, and the roads emptied of everything, except soldiers and fear. Here is what almost nobody tells you about the years that followed. While the big factories burned, something else survived, something small, artisanal, almost invisible to the bombs because it was too modest to be worth targeting. Italy's coach builders, the tiny family-run workshops that hand-shaped metal bodies over wooden frames, that employed craftsmen who had learned their trade from their fathers and intended to pass it to their sons, were mostly spared. And when the war ended, those workshops still had their tools, their knowledge, and an almost desperate hunger to make something beautiful again. They just needed a platform to build on, a chassis, something cheap, available, and structurally sound enough to take whatever shape an imaginative hand might give it. You already know what they chose. 1947, 2 years after the war. Italy is technically at peace, but the peace feels provisional, like something that might still be taken back. Food rationing is only just easing in some areas. The roads are still pocked with craters that no local authority has the budget to repair. In Turin, you can see the ghost outlines of bombed buildings in the gaps between what's left standing empty lots, where entire city blocks used to be, already filling with weeds. And yet the Mille Miglia is back. The great Italian road race, one of the most celebrated and dangerous motorsport events in the world, returned in 1947 as if the country needed to prove something to itself. Fiat entered it with the 1100S, a purpose-built lightweight sports car with fiberglass bodywork, flared wheel arches, twin carburetors, and a tuned version of that familiar four-cylinder engine producing around 51 horsepower. The result silenced a few skeptics. 4 of them finished in the top 10 overall, not in class. Overall. Against everything that Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, and the specialist constructors could put on the road. A family car tuned and lightened, yes, but fundamentally the same animal, beating dedicated racing machinery at the most demanding event in Europe. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because the engineering underneath was genuinely, quietly excellent. You cannot fake that over 1,000 miles. But the racing story, remarkable as it is not the most important thing the 1100 did in those years. Here's what was actually happening at the same time, in workshops all across northern Italy. When Fiat resumed civilian production after the war, the 1100B in 1947, the updated 1100E in 1950, those surviving coach-building workshops finally had their platform. The 1100 chassis was simple. It was affordable. It was structurally honest, in a way that gave creative people genuine room to experiment. And the small workshops, which had kept their staff and their skills intact through the chaos, were ready. Ghia, Zagato, Pininfarina, Stabilimenti Farina, Vignale, Fisore, Boneschi, Viotti. Today, these are names associated with the most glamorous and expensive cars ever made. In the late 1940s, they were doing something far more unglamorous. They were practicing, building their craft, trying things that didn't always work on a platform that was cheap enough to experiment with and robust enough to survive the experiments. Cabriolets, berlinettas, spiders, panoramiche, with curved glass roofs, jardinette, estate bodies with wooden trim. Every form imaginable, shaped in aluminium, using the superleggera technique, super light construction, over steel wireframes that Carrozzeria Touring had perfected, and the others were now adopting and refining. At the 1949 Rome Concours d'Elegance, Pininfarina unveiled a coupe based on the 1100E that stopped the room. Elegant, low, Utterly contemporary in a way that made everything around it look slightly dated. Nobody in that crowd was thinking about the modest engine beneath the bonnet. They were thinking about the shape, the proportion, the line from nose to tail that seemed to belong to a car worth 10 times the price. That is what the 1100 gave Italy in those years, not just transport, a canvas. And on that canvas, an entire generation of designers learned to speak the visual language that would, within a decade, make Italian automotive style the most admired and imitated in the world. If this kind of history, the real story, the one hiding underneath the famous story, is what you come here for, then subscribe to this channel right now. We do this every week. Leave a comment below telling me which detail surprised you most. Like the video if it gave you something. And if you know someone who loves cars or history, send it to them. It costs you nothing and it means a great deal to us. 1953, the Geneva Motor Show, March. Cold outside, electric, inside. Fiat pulls the cover off something new. The 1000, 100/103, a completely redesigned car. Unibody construction, meaning the body and chassis are welded together into a single structure rather than sitting separately on a frame. Lighter, stiffer, more modern in every dimension. The body is clean and contemporary, with a fresh face that announced, without shouting, that Italy was moving forward. Underneath that new skin, the familiar 1089cc four-cylinder engine remained. Fiat knew better than to abandon something that had proven itself over more than a decade, and a war. The standard version produced around 36 horsepower. The sportier variant, the 1100 TV, standing for Turismo Veloce, fast touring shown at the Paris Salon in October of that same year, extracted 48 horsepower from the same basic unit. Not enormous numbers by any measure, but sufficient, always sufficient. The real significance of 1953, however, had nothing to do with horsepower figures. That same year, and this is worth paying close attention to, three things happened in Italy simultaneously that historians now identify as the true beginning of the economic miracle. The state energy company Eni was founded to develop Italy's newly discovered natural gas reserves in the Po Valley. The government approved major legislation providing investment loans for industrial development in the south, and Fiat announced it would invest 300 billion lire to expand and rebuild the Mirafiori plant in Turin. 300 billion lire, in a country where the average family was still making careful decisions about what they could and could not afford to eat. What was Fiat staking that kind of money on? A conviction, a belief which turned out to be entirely correct, that Italy was on the verge of becoming something it had never been before. A country of consumers, a country where ordinary working people would, within a generation, expect to own not just a home and a refrigerator and a television, but a car. Between 1958 and 1963, the Italian economy grew at roughly 6% per year. Industry exploded across the north. The factories of Turin and Milan ran through the night. And something else happened, something that reshaped Italian society in ways that are still felt today. Hundreds of thousands of workers began moving from the rural south to the industrial north, from Calabria, from Sicily, from Basilicata and Campania, from villages where the land had been farmed the same way for generations and where there was simply no future left to wait for. They came to Turin. They worked at Mirafiori, on the line, building the very cars that would come to represent the new Italy. They lived 6 to a room in the early years, in suburbs that grew faster than any city planner could manage. They sent money south every month. And when they had saved enough, when the arithmetic of installment payments finally seemed survivable, they bought a car. Usually a Fiat, very often the 1100. Because the 1100 occupied exactly the right position in the market. Above the tiny Fiat 600, which had caused genuine public excitement when it paraded through the streets of Turin in 1955, below the more expensive Fiat 1300 and 1500. It was the car of the aspiring working class, the car that said something specific and important. I have moved, I have worked, I have arrived, not at the top, but off the bottom. I am no longer a contadino, a peasant who belongs to the land. I am someone who owns a machine and can go where I choose. In a country that had been, within living memory, one of the poorest in Western Europe, that was not a small thing, that was everything. In 1956, more than 100 Fiat 1100s were entered in the Mille Miglia, not factory cars, not professional racing teams with engineers and mechanics, and tire strategies. 100 and more private citizens, accountants and teachers and salesmen and factory supervisors who owned a family saloon and decided that entering the most famous road race in Italy was a perfectly reasonable weekend activity. Think carefully about what that tells you. That is not enthusiasm. That is something deeper. That is a level of confidence in a machine that only comes from years of experience, from knowing, from daily use, from every breakdown that did not happen and every hill that was climbed in the rain without complaint, that this car will not let you down when it matters. No marketing campaign produces that. Only a machine that genuinely, consistently delivers produces that. Now, I want you to sit with something for a moment, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable in an important way. The economic miracle was real. The numbers were real. The transformation of Italy from a predominantly agricultural society to a modern industrial economy in the space of roughly 15 years was one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. In 1951, a visitor to Rome might have seen ox carts sharing the road with the occasional automobile. By 1963, that same visitor would have found roads crowded with Fiats and Vespas, families buying refrigerators and washing machines, young people watching television and dreaming about holidays by the sea. But the miracle had shadows, real ones, that the celebratory accounts tend to leave out. The south of Italy, which had contributed so many of its people to build that prosperity in the north, received far less of it back. The industrial cities of Turin and Milan grew wealthy, while large parts of Calabria and Sicily and the deep interior remained exactly as they had been: poor, underdeveloped, and increasingly hollowed out by the very migration that was powering the North's growth. The families left behind watched their sons and daughters disappear to the factories and sent prayers along with them. Women who entered the workforce in those years and the factories drew them in by the thousands found conditions that were, by any honest accounting, exploitative: low wages, limited rights, a classification system that placed them below male workers, regardless of the work they actually performed. Throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, Italian women workers in factories and on farms fought what historians call a classification struggle, a battle simply to have their status as workers recognized and to become entitled to the social protections that male workers took for granted. The 1100 was present in all of that, not as a cause, but as a witness. The car that a line worker at Mirafiori bought on a payment plan while his mother in Calabria still drew water from a well. The car that made physical freedom possible, the freedom to go where you chose, to visit family across the country, to load your belongings and begin again somewhere new, but only for those who could reach it. History is rarely simple. The Fiat 1100 is not a symbol of a perfect story. It is a symbol of a real one, with all the texture and contradiction that real stories carry. And now the detail that, when I first came across it, genuinely stopped me. In 1969, the 1100 was discontinued in Europe. The Fiat 128 front-wheel drive, transverse engine, a genuinely revolutionary piece of engineering, arrived to replace it. Europe moved on, as Europe does. But in India, the 1100 did not die. Under a licensing agreement, the car had been built there since the early 1960s by Premier Automobiles Limited, and it kept going. Under the name Padmini after a legendary Rajput queen, the same fundamental platform, the same engineering logic that Dante Giacosa had first committed to paper in 1937, was still being manufactured in Mumbai, still rolling off the line, still being sold to families who needed exactly what it had always offered: something reliable, affordable, and honest. The last Padmini was built in the year 2000. A car designed in 1937, still in production in the year 2000. 63 years. That is not a legacy. That is proof of concept on a timescale that almost nothing in automotive history can match. Here's what the full picture shows, when you step back far enough to see it. The coach builders who learned their craft on the 1100 chassis in the late 1940s, who practiced their shaping and their proportioning and their understanding of what makes a car beautiful on a platform affordable enough to experiment with, went on to define the visual identity of the most celebrated automobiles of the 20th century. Pininfarina began its legendary collaboration with Ferrari in earnest in 1952, a partnership that produced some of the most beautiful objects ever put on four wheels. Ghia's work so captured the imagination of American designers that Chrysler was sending its people to Turin for creative direction throughout the 1950s. Zagato's ultra-light racing bodies on Aston Martins and Alfa Romeos became objects of lasting reverence. Vignale and Michelotti reshaped how the world understood automotive proportion. Without the 1100 as a proving ground, there is no golden age of Italian coach building. Without that golden age, there is no Ferrari mystique, as the world came to know it. Without that mystique, the entire ecosystem of Italian design culture, the fashion, the furniture, the architecture, the global reputation for an almost untranslatable quality of elegance looks different, less certain of itself, less magnetic. That is an extraordinary thing to say about an ordinary car, but it is a true thing. So the next time someone asks you which Italian car changed history, and they will expect you to say Ferrari, or Lamborghini, or the little Fiat 500, you'll know the real answer. It was the one nobody was looking at, the one that just showed up every morning and did the work, the one that carried a generation of ordinary people from one version of their country into another, quietly and without ceremony, the way the most important things always happen. The cars that change the world rarely announce themselves. They just run. If this video gave you something, subscribe to this channel. We're here every week with stories like this one. Hit the like button. Leave a comment below telling me what you knew about this era and what surprised you. And if you have a friend who would appreciate this kind of history, send it to them right now. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.